Welcome back to Logic Basics. Remember, we're in a series of arguments about being. Can reason get us to eternal being? This next topic is going to be about the soul. Does something non-material exist? In the last episode, we talked about matter and the problems with saying matter is eternal. I said matter is not self-maintaining, so it can't be eternal. Today we're going to ask, is matter all there is? And are there arguments that the soul or something non-material exists? So let's go back to the handout, and we're going to do two arguments back to back. One is that the soul or the spirit exists. Now, there are lots of words used for this reality. So let's talk about definitions first. Mind, soul, spirit, self. These are terms that are used for the reality of consciousness or self-awareness. So mind, soul, spirit, these are different words, and it may be that there's a history of why these words are used, and there's a proliferation of terms for the same reality. My suspicion is that in ancient philosophy, soul was used for this reality, the non-physical part of humans that's permanent. But in the modern period of philosophy, when you get to Descartes, it's changed to mind. And he talked about the mind is in the body. So they're all talking about consciousness, though. Spirit, self, these may be religious terms, maybe theistic terms, spirit, and Eastern religious talks about the self. All right, so these are all terms for consciousness or self-awareness, something non-physical. Now, spirit has no size, and it is conscious, and so we want to know, okay, is there such a thing as a spirit, and what is doing the thinking? So if there is thinking, we have to explain the reality of thinking either in terms of matter or spirit, okay? So let's go back to this idea that all that exists is matter, like the material monist says. I'm going to give you a second argument. Again, it has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. Here we go. Major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. Again, there are reasons for the minor premise because usually the minor premise in an argument is the controversial premise. So let's look at the major premise. If all that exists is matter, then thinking, remember thinking is concepts, judgments, and arguments, would be motion of atoms in the brain. What? I know students sometimes think, this is a straw man argument. This is a straw man statement, Dr. Burton. Is it though? Let's think about this. Matter, and if we have to explain thought, what's doing the thinking? Your brain. What is your brain made up of? Tissue. What is tissue made up of? Atoms. What about the neural impulses in the brain? What about the electrical charges in the brain? That's also made up of atoms. If all that exists is matter, all is atoms. So this major premise is not a straw man. If all is matter, then thinking would have to be motion of atoms in the brain. Everything is motion of atoms. So if matter is all that exists. Now, the minor premise denies this. It says thinking is not motion of atoms in the brain. Thinking is not motion of atoms in the brain. I know you've been told this all your life. Maybe you want to go, oh, but what about this? What about that? Let's look at the conclusion first, and then we'll go over the reasons for the minor premise. Therefore, all is not matter. Okay? So remember, if all is matter, thinking would be motion of atoms in the brain. Thinking is not motion of atoms in the brain, therefore all is not matter. And if all is not matter, the implication is there's something non-material. But let's go over the reasons for saying thinking is not motion of atoms in the brain. I think you can start connecting the dots with what we've been learning so far in this study. Thoughts are evaluated in terms of being meaningful or not meaningful. Remember, concepts are meaningful or they're not meaningful. Judgments are either true or false. Arguments are valid or sound. So these are how we evaluate thoughts. Meaningful, non-meaningful, true, false, valid, sound. Now let's talk about motion. To say that thinking is motion of atoms in the brain, what the major premise is saying is to use the is of identity. Thinking is motion of atoms in the brain. It's like A is A. And if two things are identical, then they share the same properties. So if thinking is motion of atoms in the brain, then this and this have the same properties. So I just went over the properties of thought. Concepts, judgments, and arguments. Meaningful, not meaningful. True, false. Valid, sound. What about motion? Let's evaluate motion. Talk about the properties of motion. We could talk about up and down, fast or slow, straight or curved, and there are probably a number of ways we can describe the properties of motion, but none of these are identical with the properties of thought. There's no true fast or valid curved or meaningful up. These are category mistakes to say that. So you can't say that motion is thought. Thought cannot be reduced to motion of atoms. And this is a very well recognized problem in the discussion of material monism or materialism and what's called the problem of consciousness. You can't reduce thinking to properties of matter. Okay, they're non-material. Where are your concepts right now? In your brain? Where in your brain? Okay, we're going to get to that next. There is a book I just remembered. I'm trying to think of. It's probably behind me, actually. Somewhere in all of these books. Koons, that's the author. Yeah, here's the book. The Waning of Materialism. The Waning of Materialism. Here, let me put it up here. And it is by Robert Koons and George Beeler. These are philosophers who edited this volume. But here are some of the topics in this volume. Against materialism, a simple view of consciousness, property dualism argument, the self-consciousness argument, persons in the unity of consciousness. So this is a very well-known problem in philosophy, in the position of material monism. And this book is The Waning of Materialism. It's saying that this view is becoming less and less popular because of the weight of arguments against it. So I challenge you to do some research and think about the reality of thinking, and can you reduce thinking to what is happening in your brain, the physical properties in your brain. I know you're going to say, though, but look, what happens when a person gets knocked out, or a person has a part of their brain taken out, or a brain injury? It affects their thinking. Yes, that may be true, but does that mean that thinking is reducible to the brain, or does that mean that there's a connection between what happens in our brain and our thoughts, that there's a body-mind connection? So just because brain injuries affect our thinking doesn't mean the brain is the only part of our thinking, or the brain is the cause of our thinking. Maybe the brain is a necessary feature to human thinking because we have a body, but it's not sufficient in explaining thinking. So I'm going to pause here, but I'll give you a preview of the next argument, and it is going to be about your brain. All right, so here's the preview. If all is not matter, then something non-material exists. So this is an argument that the soul exists. Okay, the last argument, thinking can't be reduced to the brain, and if all is matter, then thinking must be motion of atoms in the brain, but it's not, so all is not matter. But now we need a positive argument, an argument that something non-material exists. So this is the next in our series. It's going to be exciting.